Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Jaway Ayub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. Or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Christopher Wong. He's a writer and researcher, and I primarily had him on to talk about an article that he wrote for Lausanne on the Tiananmen massacre of '89. So we discussed the Tiananmen massacre and its historical context, the meaning of Tiananmen, how we remember it, and what we erase when doing so. We discussed the 20th century as essentially having a before and after Tiananmen, more or less. We discussed the cause of denialism, in which I made some Syria comparisons as well. We then moved towards a discussion on the pros and cons of occupying the squares versus occupying the factories, and so on and so forth. There's quite a few other topics that we got into. He even discussed and he proposed a sort of analysis on how to understand online tankiesm, i.e. the section of the so-called left that is very authoritarian, and a number of other things as well. So that's it for me, folks. I'm not going to say too much more. The conversation is long as it is. So as usual, thank you for listening and take care.
All right, my name's Christopher Wong. I don't know if I'm going to say unfortunately, but I'm probably better known as the Ice Must Be Destroyed guy, which is how everyone seems to think of me. I'm a researcher for Cools on Media, so I work on Behind the Bastards. I work on It Could Happen Here. I work on a few other sort of podcast projects, and yeah, I also write stuff and sort of used to be an academic and then decided that I did not in fact want to do this for the rest of my life, so I became a podcaster instead, which, you know, debatable whether or not I'm trading up or down there, but
well, I'm doing both and I'll let you know whether that works.
Yeah.
Okay, so the main topic of our conversation will be around the article that you wrote for Lausanne, which is titled "When Communists Crushed the International Workers' Movement." It's one of those titles that some people on the internet would love, and other people on the internet who I don't really like would not love so much, I think. But okay, so let's start with just if it's okay, just give us some background into the piece, like what is it about, and what are some of the main arguments that you make in it.
Yeah. So the reason I wrote this is that the quality of discourse about Tiananmen is really bad. And this is true both in the sense of sort of, you know, these constant weird arguments about like whether it happened at all, but like, you know, the academic discourse isn't very good either. And, you know, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that on a very basic level, people don't understand what actually happened there. And you know, I mean, this is true in a couple of senses. One is a sort of more historical sense. We'll get to that in a second. The other one is that, you know, people don't understand what actually happened there. And, you know, so I think most people have sort of an understanding of, okay, so there's a bunch of students, they're protesting, they're in Tiananmen Square, they're in the middle of Beijing, and they protest and the tanks roll in. Now, the thing is that only gives you a small part of the picture. And the reason it only gives you a small part of the picture is that, well, for one thing, but by the time the tanks roll in, most of the students have left. Like hundreds of thousands of them leave the square as the sort of protests go on, because, you know, the stuff those students are demanding, they're sort of pro-democracy. Mostly what they want is they want economic reforms to sort of go faster. So they want marketization to happen faster. They want privatization to happen faster. They're sort of angry that the sort of party bureaucracies not doing that fast enough. And so they play all these weird series of like hunger strikes, and they're trying to play these factional games inside the CCP, and it doesn't work. It's just like nothing happens, none of it works. And so, and like they really weird stuff starts happening. Like the student leaders start kidnapping each other to like so they're fighting over control of the platform, the microphones, and like they're trying to like declaring themselves like the grand marshal or whatever, and they start kidnapping, and it's a disaster. But then this is what's happening inside the square. What people tend not to know about is that outside of the square, the sort of the rest of Beijing shows up. And originally, it's just a bunch of sort of ordinary people, and they're sort of angry that the government's treating the students badly. But what happens very quickly is that you get this enormous mobilization by just Beijing's working class, and this happens through. I mean, even like the Beijing's like trade unions who are like basically state operated like like even the state trade unions are like this is messed up, and then you start to see this sort of like autonomous worker organizing, and especially in as the sort of protests go on and the student movement collapses, the workers movement is accelerating. Like they take over this giant part of Beijing in this sort of like ring around the square itself, and the students won't let them into the square, but like they set up like fortifications, they have all these barricades, they're like running food to each other, they have this sort of like commune appears, and that's like those are the people who the army like that's when the army starts getting sent in, and those are the people who mostly die, right? Like almost most of the killing when the tanks roll in, when the army comes in, like they basically like they slaughter their way through Beijing's working class into the square, and then once they're in the square they kill some more people, but like most of it's already happened on the outside. And there's like a couple, and when I say couple I mean literally two, like maybe three accounts talking about the workers themselves. So I was looking at this, and this struck me as just a kind of just a profound misunderstanding of like what was actually happening, because again, like the most important sort of like largest part of this movement was these workers. And so you start looking at them, you start reading what they actually wrote, and it turns out like the thing that those workers want is they want democracy in the factory, and they're very explicit about. I mean, okay, they're kind of cryptic about that part. They're very explicit about they're complaining a lot about what they call one man rule in the factory, which is basically like, okay, so this is how all of our workplaces work, right? Like you have a boss, you have to listen to the boss. If you don't listen to the boss fires you, and they're extremely angry at this, and they're like, oh, there's a pro democracy movement. So the pro democracy movement means that there shouldn't be one guy doing arbitrary rule in the factory. And I looked at that and I was like, oh wait, hold on. There's a whole history of people who made basically this demands, and Tiananmen's like the last time this happens. And so that's sort of the impetus behind the article, is looking at sort of tracing that history of the sort of like I kind of had problems coming up with the actual an actual term for it, because it's a lot of different sort of movements and ideologies that all have as essential principle that the workplace should be run democratically. But yeah, that's sort of the basis of it was trying to partially tell the story of like what actually happened to these workers who are the sort of the majority of like who was actually there at the square, and then also trying to situate them within the history of the sort of broader workers movement that they are basically the last component of.
Right, and it's that last bit that I think is one of the most interesting arguments in the piece, which is that this was like the last of something. And so there is a it could have been titled like the meaning of Tiananmen, essentially, and I think that's one of the subtitles in the text anyway. And so I'm just gonna quote you if that's okay. There's a paragraph that you wrote. The battle between the Chinese army and workers of Beijing was the end of a century and a half long struggle between the core of the classical workers movement, which advocated for democracy in the factory, and its opponents, communists, fascists, and democratic capitalists alike, who insisted on one-man rule in the factory, which is what you just mentioned. The final victory of one-man rule in the factory and in every other workplace forged the fundamental structure of our society, shaping it in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. It is only by placing the massacre at Tiananmen in its true context, the collapse of the classical workers' movement and the death of the democratic principle in the workplace, that we can begin to untangle the shifts in the global economy and the underlying changes in the nature of the working class itself that produce the modern world, end quote. But other than being really well written,
Thanks.
This means a lot. Like in some sense, like you're arguing that this isn't just as it's often portrayed. So I'll just say how I remember growing up, and when I heard about it, whenever that was. I mean, I was born in 91, so it was after. But when at some point growing up, I remember, well, this tank man, and something bad happened on the square, and I know there was pro-democracy, and the government didn't like that. That's pretty much what most people, I think, know. And I mean, that's not false. It's part of the story. But what you're arguing is that it's not just more than that. It's not just more than you had these pro-democracy students who were saying X and the government did not want X. And it's not just that the soldiers were committed massacres. It's not just that, which is important, but is that it was happening in this specific context. What does it tell you? A, if that's okay, talk a bit about that. And also, like, what does it tell you that this isn't how, like, what does it tell you that the way I remember it, the way what I was taught, it wasn't in school even. I probably some documentary or I just Googled it or something. I don't remember.
Yeah.
But like if this is the main thing that people remember, what does it say about what it erases, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think this is a sort of important point, especially because so like I grew up in like and this is something like I grew up in this sort of like Chinese American community, and this is like the Chinese American community is like their big political thing in terms of China is like memory. And they have this whole thing about how like we have to remember what happened, we have to remember what happened. The CCP is trying to erase history. We have to remember what happened, and they have no idea what happens. They have no clue. Like none of this stuff. None of them know any of this stuff. And I think when I was when I was in college, I was studying stuff like this too, and I kept running into there's a few times this happens. So like almost exactly this the same all the same arguments, all of the same like stuff that's happening, all the same sort of liberal misinterpretations, all of the same sort of like authoritarian misinterpretations. This all happens with the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, and again with the Czech Revolution in 68. And the more and actually if you want to look at it again, like almost exactly the same thing happens in Spain for the Spanish Civil War. And I think what it's about is that it's very important for everyone whose main political principle, and and they will never say this is their main political principle, but it's something that they like liberals or sort of like reactionaries, like they won't explicitly ever say, or social democrats, they won't explicitly ever say that the thing that they believe is that there should be a boss in the factory who runs production. Like they won't say this, right? They won't say that the fundamental basis of their political principle is that that the workplace needs to be governed by a set of hierarchical logics, blah 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 blah. But it's extremely important. And the reason they will never talk about this is because it's enormously damaging ideologically for anyone to go, hey, wait, hold on, why is there democracy in one sphere and not in democracy in another? Why is and this means that whenever one of these movements breaks out, there's this immediate attempt to make sure that like nobody actually nobody remembers that there was another possibility. And and this is not the only movement happens to, like the non-aligned movement, which has a lot of even more problems than the sort of democratic movement, like is also like this, where like there's this whole just sort of attempt to just erase it from history, make sure nobody remembers it. And but I think this specifically, with when you look at like the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, it's you have these two sets of superpowers, right? You have the US, you have these sort of capital superpowers, and you have the USSR, and neither of them, so the US's whole thing is, okay, so we have democracy and we have capitalism. The USSR's thing is like, okay, so we have like socialism, we have communism, we have whatever they're going to call the, I think they're calling it people's democracy by that point. But it's like, okay, so we have this sort of social system, we have all these like safety net stuff, but there's no democracy, right? And so both sides want it to be impossible for there to be a faction that is like essentially pro-socialist and pro-democracy at the same time, but like in pro-democracy in the sense of like we should democratically decide how we run production, how we should run stuff, and that is extremely dangerous, because when people start to this happens sort of across the sort of course of the 20th century, is when people start to ask these questions, you get these enormous revolts. And this is a lot of what's happening. I mean, this is a lot of what sort of Bay 68 was. This is what the sort of a lot of the workers' parts of the uprisings in France, uprisings in Italy, and China's kind of a weird case, but in Czechoslovakia was, okay, wait, why is there not democracy in the factory? And and this is this sort of leads into another part of this, which is that there's this is this is the sort of specter of this is something that like haunts both sort of the Soviet and the American ruling classes throughout this entire period. And the Soviet ruling class responds to this by basically sort of imploding, and the American ruling class responds to it by just setting out to just like obliterate this stuff completely from the historical memory, making sure that nobody remembers it, like this was ever a demand, this like was ever a thing that was possible, and also sort of restructuring society in a way to make sure it'll never happen again. And so I think you get this sort of you get this sort of this place where memory and sort of history and the sort of the memory of the historical record and the sort of what people actually were demanding in a given period of time runs into this sort of ideological barriers, and the actual memory of the event just crumples in the face of that. And I think that there's also one other thing I should mention, which is that like, so the I was talking earlier about how sort of the worst repression like falls on the workers, and some of the students make it out, and that means that the story of Tiananmen that's that you get in Hong Kong, that in the story that sort of spreads, and part of this also has to do with the fact that like the Western press is like the Western press is like in Tiananmen Square, right? So they're watching the students, they're not watching the workers, they're not watching any of what like that part's happening, and that means that the people who tell the story are the surviving students, and the students really really did not like the sort of working class factions at all. Like they wouldn't let them into the square. They were like incredibly sort of like elitist and sort of hostile to them, and that also has a really big part in shaping the narrative of it. And then and it's further shaped by the fact that this is one of the weird things about Tiananmen that also like doesn't get talked about much, is that like, so some of the students get killed, but like a lot of them get rehabilitated and like go back into the party. And so the sort of institutional memory, right, of the event on the Chinese side is also from sort of the soldiers, and it's from the students. And so you have on both sides, it's the memory sort of dominated by the students, and they were always sort of like they're kind of like elitist technocrats in a lot of ways. And so their view of it was obviously, of course, like, oh, but what do you mean? Like, what is this like democracy in the factory stuff? Like, what we don't like this. Like, we're just gonna like write it out of history because it's inconvenient to us. And so yeah, and the product of that is the sort of popular memory of Tiananmen, which is that Tiananmen's it's about democracy. Some students died, and then it was bad, but the workers just get written out of it.
And you mentioned how like you talk about that period between roughly April 15th, 1989 and June 4th, 1989, more or less, like the transition from one world to the next. One way that we can think of what came after 89, roughly 89, 90, 1991, more or less, depending on where we are in the world, and in some periods, in some places a bit later, is that it became like basically structurally more difficult to have democracy at the factory, because if you start demanding that, the company often can basically say, well, I'm just gonna move across the border, I'm just gonna go there, I'm just gonna go, etc. And this, we broadly identify, or we broadly call this neoliberalism these days, has made something like it is one of the reasons why I think you separate between essentially like there's a before and after, before and after Tiananmen, before and after the 89, more or less, basically. The thing that's difficult or a number of things. One thing that I think it's difficult for a lot of people to think about that as before and after, although I agree with you, is that the before can also seem pretty bad. So because often when we think of the Cold War, it's often portrayed, I know it's of course wrong, and we can talk about that, but US, USSR essentially, and a lot of people will have issues with the US model, but usually even more issues with the USSR model. And so it's seen, that, oh well, this is basically the lesser of two evils. And of course there's a non-aligned movement, and there's the issues within the non-aligned movement, which this is kind of a simplification, but has reinforced the notion among many, not everyone, that, well, it's not working there either, so it is really about either this or that, and this is the one that won out at the end of the Cold War, etc., etc. So that's one thing. The other thing, which I'm not saying is good or I mean, it's wrong, I disagree with it, but I think it's how I used to come at it, essentially, before I kind of did more reading, let's say. The other thing, for me, Tiananmen is very like on the maybe more emotional side of things, I'm not sure, but it's I think of it in along the same terms as Sarajevo or Syria more recently and ongoing, essentially. Not that these are the same events; they're not very different contexts and so on and so forth. But in the sense of how something gets remembered and not remembered, and who gets to remember, and how often or for how long would survivors, for example, of when we talk about Sarajevo or Srebrenica, etc., how long would they still have to fight battles of against denialism, which in the Bosnian case is very much still ongoing,
Yep.
as we know, and in the Syrian case, which is slightly closer, although it's still a very different context to Tiananmen. I mean, for me, what's incredible is that most of the time, even amongst people that I consider as having good politics or just meaning well, let's say, they just mean well, most people still don't know much about the first year or two of the revolution, like the local councils, the what are they called in English? The local coordination committees, LCCs, LCs, and so on. They may, some people on the kind of like anti-authoritarian left may know more about Rojava, for example, which is good, that matters. But for the most part, either they don't know about what happened in 2011, or they basically say, well, there was some good stuff that happened, but it was soon crushed. The thing is that that is true, like it was crushed and it is still being crushed, but I still think that a lot happened. And in those months, essentially, when in the case of Syria, in the case of Tiananmen, it was a couple of months, I believe, April to June. In the case of Syria, it's more or less a year and a half until when the militarization of the revolution started taking over, and then, of course, with the crackdown, which was already happening, started even intensifying even more. But they had managed feats of what we might call mutual aid, although no one was calling it that. They were just calling it local councils and local coordination committees and other terms. And some people who didn't even use these terms, like they were doing it without joining any kind of official quote unquote thing. They were doing this on a pretty significantly, like on a pretty mass scale. And that is, it's what interests me. For a long time, that just tired me. So it was just tiring for me to think of how this is being ignored and erased and so on. Now, let's say in the past couple of years or so, it's what interests me is how it affects people who actually participated in them, or people who knew people who participated in them. And this is the bit that is often not talked about as much, in the sense that they get to it's almost like they, on some psychological levels, maybe subconscious level, and I've had conversations with friends who like even had like loved ones forcibly disappeared and stuff, telling me at times like they have to, it's not that they forget that this happened, but in certain settings, let's say online on Twitter, or even when they go to meetings or protests or whatnot, it's almost like they have to remind people that this is still their experience, that their experience hasn't changed. And what the link between that and Tiananmen for me, and you tell me if this makes sense or not, is kind of that, is how memory in itself can be weaponized. And it just so happened that the guest I had on before you, obviously, which would be out by the time this episode's out, Suzanne Kane, she wrote this book called Nothing Happened History. And it's basically about when we say that nothing happened or nothing changed, or I don't know which other examples, we're usually actually talking about something, right? We're saying that we're dissatisfied with the lack of change, and that usually is because of an expectation that we had, for better or worse. And so for me, Tiananmen reminds me a bit of that. Like a lot of people will say, well, they did all of this and then nothing happened, in the sense that, no reforms came, or there was no recognition of what the workers went through, so on. You can kind of go down, go down the list, essentially. This transition from one world to the other, which obviously wasn't an overnight thing. It wasn't even that we can pinpoint and say this is what before meant and this is what after meant. It's more like a spectrum in some sense. At least that's how I'm visualizing it. How is it for you to sort of, how does it feel, if that makes sense, or when you are in situations where you are talking about Tiananmen and the meaning of Tiananmen and all of these things, what are certain obstacles that you feel that you're facing, either ideologically or emotionally, or I don't really know, whether from you or from the other person that you're having this conversation with, or maybe you're just observing certain conversation on the internet or what have you. What are certain thoughts on your part on that?
It's an interesting question. I don't know. Tiananmen's, I guess it's kind of cliche, but Tiananmen is like extremely emotionally charged, right? Like, this is one of, so my family like came like, wasn't in like was well, okay. So I mean, some of them were in China, but most of them were in Taiwan. The people who were in China were in like Inner Mongolia while this was going on. So we weren't directly involved, but like, a lot of the diaspora, like if you like, I don't know, like I have friends who are like, yeah, I mean, like, one of the things that'll happen every once in a while was like, yeah, if you have like a parent who was in China at that point, like every once in a while they'll make an oblique reference to like, oh yeah, people disappeared, like, oh yeah, like there were tanks in the streets, like you get this very, it has this really incredible psychological effect on the people who survived, the people who sort of watch this stuff happen. It like, I think like in the American context, there's this thing that I think some people know about, which is about like the people who lived through the Great Depression, like they like act differently than people who didn't, where like, they hoard stuff, they have all these sort of like, yeah, like they had there's still this like sort of like psychic like psychological resonance of this event, and that's still there for Tiananmen. But I think, I don't know, I think one of the reasons I think that that denialism is, sort of why it sort of uses a tactic is that it focuses everything on, did something happen or did it not, and you lose, you lose the ability to pull out and look at like, both okay, you lose the ability to sort of to zoom in and focus specifically on on a very 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 like individual level, like what this did to people, and then you lose the ability to sort of zoom out and look at like what was possible, and then what the effect, like what the actual sort of effects of this were. And I think you see this, with Syria. It's like, yeah, like the Syria is a very explicit example of this, where you have the denialism at the same time as like, these councils are being bombed out of existence by Assad and by sort of the sort of like right-wing Islamist groups. And and it becomes this like, denialism is like the third bomb, I guess. I don't know why I took third specifically, but it's like, it's something that after you've killed these people, then you can sort of make them never have existed.
Yeah,
you can make what they did never have existed. And this, in the Tiananmen case, I think is very very important, because the other thing that's important about Tiananmen is that, and it's something I talk about in the piece, that like Tiananmen is basically where the old Chinese working class dies. You have this working class has been changing, I mean, constantly, because this is how history works. But I mean, this is like the working class that's there in Beijing that day. Like that's the same working class in a lot of ways that was, like that was in Beijing in 1925, when they're doing these general strikes against the French and the Japanese and the British for their occupation. It's this is the same working class that like basically ran the nationalists out of the city in like in 1925. Like it's the same working class in Shanghai that like ran the CCP out of the city in 1967. And Tiananmen is the last, is like that working class after Tiananmen is destroyed completely. It doesn't exist anymore. It's literally replaced by basically a different working class that comes from that this sort of like, I mean, there's 270 million of these people now who this sort of migrate, this enormous, like incomprehensibly large. This is like the fourth largest country on earth, right? Like 270 million migrant workers who are mostly from rural backgrounds. So some of them are sort of moving from city to city or from town to town, but it's this enormous sort of labor migration, and like that becomes the Chinese working class. And the reason that becomes the Chinese working class is because the old working class loses and is completely destroyed. And part of what the denialism is making sure that nobody remembers that that's what happened, and that and it's about burying that class. It's about burying the group of people who I mean, Like I have this like I think like the Chinese working class in the 20th century is the most militant working class on earth. Like they overthrew like I mean they you know I mean they fight the British, they fight the French, they fight the Japanese, they fight the nationalists, they fight the communists again. I mean they fight basically everyone, and you know they a lot of the time they win, and that you know and making sure that sort of that class doesn't exist anymore, making sure that they you know not only don't exist anymore but like can never reform is like you know that's one of the biggest things that like that you know that this is why they send in the army, right? Because they have to you know they have to like just fully actually break like the sort of power of this class, and this is what's happening in a lot of the sort of you know this is what's happening in Syria too, right? I mean it's you know it's in you know one of so one of the things that sort of set me on this project in the first place was looking at how sort of profoundly different the 2011 revolutions were from like any of the other revolutionary cycles. Like, because you look at 1968, you look at like the stuff, even the stuff happening around 1917, you look at like 1936 in Spain, you know, the thing that happens when there's a revolution is that everyone goes and they form a workers' council, right? Like they go into their factories, they form councils, they start managing production democratically. And, you know, in 2011, it's like everyone goes to a square and, you know, it's like they're still doing democracy, but they're not, but it's, you know, it's sort of distended from the workplace. And you see this in Syria, like in Syria, the sort of the democratic revolutionary form is like it's these sort of these councils, there's like social councils and neighborhood councils. And, you know, and you see this very similar to Tiananmen, like everyone is immediately like, this has to stop, and starts killing them all. And I think, you know, this is, you know, this is something like this is the sort of, this is the continuity before, you know, the like quote unquote before and the quote unquote after, is that like, you know, everyone who's engaged in these struggles to sort of bring democracy into sort of any kind of sphere that didn't exist before, like they get murdered. But what's you know, and the sort of like the way that memory is weaponized, like that stuff is all very similar, because it's you know it's the same people, like the people dropping the bombs and the people like rolling the tanks in are the same people, right? Like they're fundamentally the same class. It's the ruling class is like it's the same, right? But what's different is the resistance to it, and you know, and that's you know, and that's part of what Tiananmen, you know, part of the reason that Tiananmen's interesting is because you have a bunch of people calling for democracy in the factory, but you know they've left the factory, right? They don't form factory councils. They form, you know, they form this sort of like commune in the streets, and that sort of commune in the streets thing is what the sort of like you know what that's you know that's what all the 1911 the 2011 like struggles were. So you know it becomes this kind of you know Tiananmen it's you know this is what I was talking about, like it's a transition from one world to another. It's this sort of it's the moment in which you see the sort of two like forms of revolutionary struggle of the 20th century and what becomes the forms of the 21st century sort of fused together. And you know, and it's and the sort of response to it is the same, but you know you get kind of jumping around here.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I was gonna say, like, what's interesting for me is the whole. If we think of them as two different models in some sense, is that both of them have strengths and weaknesses in some ways, and ideally we would have both of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because the weakness with the square first approach, let's just call it that, which was in the case of Syria more of a like almost an instinctual thing, just like it was the place to meet up. The weakness with that is I suppose very obvious, is that everyone's in the same place, everyone in the same location more or less, and it can be vulnerable to attacks because of that, and which is what happened. The strength of that is this whole mixing of people from different backgrounds who may not have seen really each other, or at least not talk to one another in quote unquote normal circumstances, in non-revolutionary circumstances, let's say, which was the case in Syria. The whole like, well, we're all from different sects, different background, all genders, blah blah blah. The strength of the factory-oriented strike, let's say, approach is that it's a strike. It stops things. It forces those that rely on production to continue the way it is to start paying attention, because otherwise they wouldn't. And the weakness is usually related to time and resources. Is having to do this for a long enough period of time that it changes things, or it breaks things, or it transforms things, or whatever. And that's often what happens, or a lot of the time what happens, other than being directly confronted by the cops and the army, which is of course what also happens. So that's sort of how I think of it, is that both of them have strengths and weaknesses, and rather than, as some people on the left that I can think of have kind of taken this view of, for me, I describe it as like, a view from above of just being a holier than thou, and saying, well, the Arab Spring did not have enough factory strikes and etc., and therefore it's not meaningful. For me, it's more interesting, or more valuable even, to look at, well, why was that the case? Where were the trade unions in the case of Syria? They were crushed by the Assad regime, and so and so on and so forth. And I think I can also see Tiananmen's the meaning of Tiananmen, to kind of use that terminology, also in similar contexts. I would say, why did it take the form that it take? Why did it happen in '89? What was the context, and so on? And why is okay? Then we then know why is it remembered the way it is. Then we can talk about it. But why did it happen the way it did as well? It would be, for me, an interesting conversation as well.
Yeah, I think I think this is one of the other things that I was looking at of. I think that insofar as like you want to look like, if you look at like the biggest thing that changes that like Tiananmen is the last instance of, is that like people okay, so Marxists are going to get extremely mad at me for this. Marxists have this concept that they call like the class in itself and class for itself. And so like the class in itself is like, okay, so there are sort of like objectively a group of people who depend on selling their labor for a living, right? And so like that's the class in itself. It's like that's the class as it exists in the world. But then there's something called the class for itself, which is when the group of people who do that recognize themselves as a class. And but like that's basically an identity, right? Like there is the sort of like objective, quote unquote, whatever. There are the group of people who do this, but it's also in order to get them to think like that's that's this process of identity formation. And that's what kind of stops after Tiananmen, is that people don't think of themselves as workers. And this is part of a long project of sort of the destruction of this collective identity. And one of the sort of key things of this was, I was talking to Vicky Osterweil about this, and she had this line. I don't remember.
I'm just smiling because Vicky's the next guest.
Yeah. Oh, wait, she is.
She is.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't remember if she's the one who came up with like the dark agora as the way to talk about this, but she had this point about how the reason that you get struggles in the factory, and specifically the reason you get struggles that involve taking over factories and running them democratically, is that the factory is this kind of like this kind of social. It's a dark agora. It's this kind of social. It's a social meeting place, right? It's this place where you bring a bunch of people together, and their identity is formed by the fact that they're there, by the fact that they're all working together, by the fact that they all live next to each other, by the and it's but on the other hand, like it's not like it's not like a truly democratic space. It can't be, because the point of it, like the point of the factory, is to exploit your labor in order to make money. And but this is it's still an incredibly this also happens with like the structure of coal mines, for example, particularly conducted to this, or so the sort of logistics process, especially the early 20th century. You have a bunch of people who are forced to work together in like incredibly sort of confined conditions when they have their own sort of degree of autonomy. And this forms this kind of this forms this sort of very powerful social identity. And the social identity that stuff forms is the basis of and you actually talked about this with sort of like in 2011, like the instinct is to go into the squares, right? Before Tiananmen's last instance of this, like the instinct of the working class, even when there's very little political education, the instinct of the class is to go into the factories and seize them. And that and the whole sort of like counter revolution after 1968 is about making sure that never happens again. Is that making sure that instinct is like just beaten out of the working class. And and people have been trying to do this with just pure force for like 100 years, and it just didn't work. And eventually what sort of does work is, I mean, geographically and physically separated the working class, like kicking them into the suburbs, sort of immiserating the actual conditions of the factory itself. There's this whole sort of like anytime the sort of identity becomes strong enough, you get with the sort of logistics revolution that allows you to bring like shipping containers and stuff from China, like the stuff gets sent over, jobs get sent overseas. And there's this whole sort of informalization of the economy. And there's this whole system of trying to turn workers into small business owners that's both practically and ideologically that's extremely effective. And the product of this is that by the time you get to 2011, the factory as a site where like a bunch of people can come together like doesn't exist anymore. And so, I mean, even in places like Egypt where you have like very strong trade unions, like they don't, like the trade unions never like at any point try to like occupy a bunch of factories, right? What they do is go into the squares, and I think the reason for that is, and is what you're dealing with is partially a working class that's had the identity of worker beaten out of them, and then you're also dealing with a bunch of people who've just been spit out of the labor process like altogether. You have enormous numbers of people who are unemployed, enormous numbers of people who are like in these informal sectors who are sort of like scraping by. Like, I think like the American example is like, like any time you're on like a subway, there's like a guy walking from car to car, like selling boxes of candy. Like that guy is someone who's been spit out of like the sort of he's been spit out of the sort of like normal labor process and is now in this sort of enormous informal economy. And and those people also, like what if you're the guy selling candy on the train, like what are you taking over, right? Like where is your factory? Like there isn't one. And this gives you this, this gives you this sort of square, and the square is an attempt to sort of reassemble some kind of collective identity. And yeah, it isn't like there are real strengths to that. There's weaknesses to it, and I think like there are strengths like so the sort of like sort of democratic workers would be like their biggest problem. I don't know. I don't know if it's biggest is the right word, but like okay, their biggest problem mostly is that like they're constantly outgunned and they don't really have the capacity to fight a guerrilla war because they're sort of restriction of bases the factories, and you can't really like it's really hard. You can do it. Like the Italians did it during World War II a little bit when they're fighting like the sort of the parts of resistance. Like it's a mess. But so their biggest problem is they're constantly outgunned. The second problem they have is that they because they're completely centered on just the factory or the coal mine or sort of these things is like as the center of work, they're really bad about like domestic labor and domestic production. And they're like they have a huge feminism problem, and so and I think like part of what the sort of part of like the shift out of the factory, the shift out of the workplace, like it is like there are parts of it that are really good in that like you start to get a focus on like the home. You start to get focus on sort of other parts of the production process that aren't just directly inside the factory. And and there's a thing in Algeria, for example. I talk a bit about the Algerian movement where so like after the French basically pull out of Algeria, like there's all these empty factories because a bunch of the sort of French people have left, and there's some other complicated stuff about people sort of expelling like Bedouins and stuff. But like one of the things that happens is that so you get all these people, and they all they all take over the factories, start running democratically, but like they won't let migrant workers like join the sort of like cooperatives that now own the factories. And you have these sort of tensions because the sort of democratic factory stuff, like it's a politics of place in a lot of ways too. And sometimes that becomes very hostile to people who aren't in the sort of traditional labor process, who are sort of like who are like people who are migrant workers, people who are sort of outside, who are in the informal sector. And and I think actually like that's the difference between the sort of like I think you see this less with like like with the sort of like the versions of this that are explicitly anarchist have less problems, like Spain, like have less problems with this because anarchism has always had a base, has always had as a social base like those people, like people like specifically like migrants, travelers, sort of vagrants, like that sort of like people who are mobile have always been sort of like there's always been a sort of anarchist base there. But like, in a lot of the sort of Marxist versions of this, you get that kind of stuff. And I think one of the interesting things about the stuff in Colombia that was happening been happening for the past about 3 years now, it's 3 years.
Yeah, 2 years.
Yeah, 2 years. They were trying to overcome this by they have this thing called the social strike. The social strike's like, well, okay, so we have a bunch of people. You have like labor unions going on strike. We also have just a bunch of people just like from the informal sectors. We have a bunch of indigenous people. We have a bunch of just like random people. We have a bunch of women. We have a bunch of like we have all you're trying to like bring together all of these different sort of like sectors, and then put them on sort of on these sort of barricades and roadblocks. And it worked out. It's kind of, I mean, it was sort of effective. It wasn't enough to like bring down the government, but I guess like that's I think been how people have been trying to deal with the sort of problems that both the sort of like the square model not having access, like the square model not having the ability to actually like take over production, and then the sort of the workers' council model excluding an enormous part of the population who aren't like workers in the classical sense.
Yeah, and I mean the examples that you gave. I went to this conference a couple of years ago. It was like an anarchism studies conference in the UK, and I remember one of the presentations was about how sections of I might get this wrong, but I think it's broadly accurate. But like sections of the Spanish CNT at the time, like the trade unions and the just the Confederation, were depending on who, like some of them were actually also pretty hostile to migrant workers, for example. And so the idea is to, or the I think the conclusion should be in all of these situations that you know being a victim of something doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be good on everything.
Yeah.
It doesn't give you moral powers. You're still a flawed human being, and you will still have these things that are you can still have legitimate grievances and also be part of the problem in another circumstance, let's say.
Yeah.
This isn't directly linked to the conversation on Tiananmen, but as people know by now, like the podcast kind of just goes everywhere, and that's fine. Just on how do you say it? So again, I'm just gonna use the vague formulation of the meaning of Tiananmen just because it's just this huge and broad umbrella. How could it have been different? Not in the sense of, okay, the army could have not massacred people, when this is obvious, but how could it have been different in the sense of people remembering it differently in the 90s or early 2000s, let's say? One thing that I'm thinking of, for example, this kind of thinking out loud, is that because, and this is probably my own trajectory, like I'm from the 90s, I was born in the 90s, whatever. And for me, the thing that defined essentially the past 20 years is like 9/11 and then invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan,
Yeah.
and then war on terror, etc., which, for most people, for a lot of people anyway, this will sound familiar. I'm wondering basically is that for a previous generation, like I don't know, your parents' generation, for example, maybe, would they view Tiananmen in those same terms? Like the thing about 9/11 is that often, or a lot of the time, most of what we talk about is everything that came after, like what it meant essentially and what it led to and the consequences, and obviously the war on terror and the invasions and everything from that to ISIS to what have you. You can jump around. I mean, obviously with the recent, if the fall of Kabul and the victory of the Taliban and so on, victory in quotation, we'll see how that goes, but whatever. It's still basically, it's in the ether. People are still talking about it. It's still kind of like now. I can even think of something as seemingly mundane as the Guardian Weekly's headline. I remember it was like the end of the American century or something like that. And the reason why they said that is because of the the spectacle aspect of it, of here I'm talking about the fall of Kabul, the spectacle aspect in the sense that it reminded some people of, those images of the fall of Saigon.
Yeah.
And I'm using American terms here, but like, the whole helicopters taking people, and it
Mm.
ends up being a lot of like that's sort of what gets into the history textbook, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
If there wasn't Tankman, for example, maybe even that wouldn't have. And of course I'm calling him Tankman because that's the word used, but whatever.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. Many people, I think it's fair to assume, wouldn't have remembered or thought even of Tiananmen as being of any kind of significant event in history, and even that is problematic, of course. Had it not had, sorry, these journalists in Tiananmen or people filming Tankman, and the image, of course, becoming the symbol and so on and so forth. And he said, like, it's not a very well formulated question, but like, how do we deal essentially, or how do you deal, I don't know, with this question of symbols, in the sense, by which I mean, when something is at risk of becoming a symbol, are we losing something in the process, if that makes sense? I don't know if any of this made any sense.
Yeah, no. I think it makes a lot of sense. Like, I mean, some person had a really good line about this, and I've both forgotten the person and the line, which just makes it kind of useless.
Amazing.
It's great. But I mean, like you said, like in the US, like this is what happened to Martin Luther King, right? Like everyone, Martin Luther King becomes the symbol, and then and like not just on the left, like not just on the right, like the right obviously like has no idea what he was talking about. Like the left also kind of just like has this tendency to sort of cherry pick stuff from it. Yeah, and I think this is like, I guess the way I tend to look at it is like, I guess trying to figure out why and how it happened. So like with Tiananmen, I think a lot of Tiananmen was that, but so okay, so there's this whole part of the Cold War, right, where China is like, China is an American ally in the Cold War from starting in around 19 the negotiations are beginning in like in the early 1970s, and by the mid 70s the US is just straight up an American ally. And
those are the famous Kissinger going to China.
Yeah, Kissinger going to China, and then also, I mean, this is one of the reasons why China invades Vietnam in 1979. And so, and you have this like 20-year period where China's doing market reforms, they're allying with the US, that they've reopened diplomatic negotiations with everyone. And, China's like, I mean, this is, I don't. Yeah, I've talked about this elsewhere, and I can't remember where elsewhere was, but like, there's this moment where like in Red Dawn, right? Like the only two countries that are fighting the Soviet Union, like Europe is like allied with the US, like the two countries that are fighting the Soviet Union are the US and China, right? And so I mean, China is China is seen as a sort of ally. They're seen as a sort of like market society against the communists, and then Tiananmen happens, and and it's like there's a lot of okay, so it is very easy for the American press corps to look at just a massacre, especially a massacre that's happening in East Asia, and go, this is fine. Like most of the American press corps just like did not care when Indonesia like killed all the communists. Like this happens a lot. The one thing you can't, and this is like if you're an American client state, you can kill like basically any number of people, and it doesn't matter because the press will sort of like cover for you because this is the sort of like the power of hegemony, blah blah blah. The one thing you can't do is you can't kill like pro-US, pro-democracy, pro-capitalist student protesters in front of the press corps. Like that's the one thing you can't do. And the other part of this is that like, a lot of people in the press who were in Tiananmen are like, these were people who like some of these people like were these are people who were like teenagers in 68, right? Like, who sort of who they're teenagers in 68 who sort of like turn to the right, but like this is like the thing in Tim, like this is their like perfect revolution, right? They can look back and they can project themselves onto these kids like in a square, right? It's like, oh, this was like, well, this is what we were doing in the good old days, but like these people have like an actual righteous cause unlike us, and then China just kills them all. And that is and that was always like the image of Tankman, like that was always going to sort of produce a thing. But it was the reason it was always going to produce an image like this is because this is like just in terms of a media spectacle, like this is like the perfect thing to sort of to capture the Western press corps, and they do, right. But this is where you get into the problems, because the version of Tiananmen that they're capturing is the version that they want to see, and that version has completely shaped just everything that's going after it. And this is how the workers get completely written out of it. This is how like the weird authoritarian tendencies of the student protesters gets written out of history, because that's inconvenient to these journalists who are like, hey, look at these guys, these are like, and this is the version, like that's the version that's the version that gets filtered into sort of the other, this is what gets filtered to sort of the broader sort of Chinese diaspora. And there's this other thing that's going on here where this is, and I think that like the more conventional reading of Tiananmen, if you're going to place Tiananmen in a sort of historical context, is Tiananmen is the last of the sort of, it's seen as this culmination of this sort of like, there's this wave of pro-democracy movements, and like they finally succeed in South Korea, and they finally win in Taiwan, and then and everyone looks at China and it's like, oh, this is the next of those movements. But but it's not, right? Like that's that's how my family like remembers it, like that, like it's in the context of pro-democracy movements, in the context of the fall of the Berlin Wall, like in that context. And it's just sort of but that part loses, that loses the part of that struggle that was about like that was about democracy in the factory, that was about something else, like more than just sort of this like very narrow sort of liberal conception of democracy, where democracy is something that like democracy is every 2 years you vote for someone who rules you, and then like and and the person you elect in power now rules you, and then also like none of this literally ever extends to the economic sphere. Like that whole challenge is just gone. And this and I think like if you want to understand, so Tiananmen, like I think like the arc, it's not in that arc. The arc of Tiananmen is in the arc that's sort of like that stretches back through sort of the workers' movement, and then I think stretches like stretches forwards into, I guess it's called the Pink Tide now, although that's not really I think it becomes so the Zapatistas, like in their revolt in the 90s, sort of kicks off like a second, like a wave of the new left in Latin America. And like those people mostly aren't doing exactly the same thing, but there's been a bunch of indigenous movements in Latin America in the 90s and 2000s is when they like they start taking power, and they start actually like they start bringing down governments. They start there's all these revolutions in Bolivia in particular has a bunch of them. There's in Ecuador, famously, yeah. And this is one of the the sort of arc I was tracing also, like it runs very heavily through Argentina, because Argentina actually has people who are like occupying factories in 2001, that they have this, there's this huge crisis, there's this IMF debt crisis, and people are trying to bring down the government. And that one's really interesting because Argentina has like a bunch of autonomous Marxists, like a weirdly large number of them, who are people who are sort of connected to the struggles that are happening in Italy in the 70s. And so they go back into the factories like one more time, but they kind of end up forming co-ops. And there's this really interesting history there, because I think like if you want to take like a final like a look at like what the arc of this whole thing was, the arc of Tiananmen, the arc of sort of the sort of resistance in the 21st century, is that so occupy, like the term occupy is taken from Argentina. But in Argentina, at the very beginning of it, it's like they're occupying the factories, and then it kind of moves, like diffuses, and and they start once you get to like you move over to Brazil. I'm not about, well, Brazil sort of has this with landless workers movement, stuff like that. But like Bolivia, in particular, like they have a bunch of occupations, but they have occupations of like they're taking over like municipal water services. right? Like it's not like it's in Argentina, like it is sort of framed as a workers movement, and then that like framing of it fades, and people stop occupying factories, start occupying like municipal water things. They start like taking control of things and on the basis of like the community, so the working class, and you have all this sort of stuff, and like and that term moves, like the term occupy like moves into the sort of American left based on the Argentinian example, but then like the US's big occupy movement is to try to occupy Wall Street. And so now you've moved completely from like occupying the factories, which is like Malatesta's thing from like 1921, right? You've moved from that to, we're going to go seize the center of finance, and they can't do that. And so occupy turns into holding public space. And like that I think is like, is in a lot of ways like emblematic of just what sort of has happened throughout this whole sort of process, and what should have been remembered from Tiananmen is that it's the transition point between these two things, right? Like you have a bunch of people in the streets talking about sort of like, talking about workers' democracy, but they're not in the streets, right? They're not in the factories, they're in the streets. And then, as this moves on, right, through sort of through 2011, through sort of the modern period, like it, the whole sort of you get like the total and complete collapse of the kind of like workers identity that had like caused people to occupy, cause people to say when you occupy something, you're occupying a factory. That goes to sort of, now you're occupying a park, now you're trying to occupy like, you're trying to occupy Wall Street, you're trying to sort of it becomes about reassembling that, like the sort of identity that had been formed and was sort of lost when, and when like in that final hour of the sort of classic workers who've been like when all of these people get slaughtered, like that's sort of the end of it. And and everyone sort of is living in the sort of consequences of that.
Right, and another consequence is like describe it as the democratization of finance as being the new. Well, I mean, the example of Occupy Wall Street, I suppose, is one example of that, in the sense that the thing that we in quotation broadly defined here are opposing has become in itself also less defined. It's become more decentralized in many ways. I mean, it is decentralized in the sense that, as we said before, like the nature of the working class changes in the 80s and the 90s. Well, that's a broad statement, and it becomes ever more difficult to organize, partly because of that. And I think one of the legacies of Occupy, I was pretty young when it was happening. I remember it as more of an aesthetic. I actually remember it as like, for me, when I think of Occupy, when it was happening, because like soon after, everything in my world was dominated by what we now call the Arab Spring, obviously. But before that, I think of stuff like Adbusters and stuff like that, which a lot of it and ended up actually going to pretty problematic territory. And it was all because of the vagueness of stuff like V for Vendetta and how this became a symbol, and and so on and so forth. It's kind of a discussion in and of itself, and I don't necessarily think I'm the best person to talk about it. But one thing that I have noticed, which I think is fair, is that I'm not necessarily against the aesthetic. I'm kind of still on the fence about everything, about these things. At some level, I feel like you need some color, if that makes sense. You need some art, some aesthetic, something, and I'm not against that at all. And we saw some of the one of the reasons why those of us who participated in the October stuff in Lebanon in 2019, and part of what was allowing people to sort of maintain what one former guest, Lina Munzer, who I've had her on a number of times, she described as a high, like we were basically all of us high, collectively high in some sense. That was part of what was allowing that to happen. The humor, I don't really know how to describe it. I don't really know. It's not very palpable in some sense, in some ways, but I do. It's almost like we have a lot of that and not much of the let's strike aspect of things, you know.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm more like, I don't really know. It's just very easy for a lot of people to just go on Twitter and condemn a protest for not being radical enough, or whatever that means, which is what a lot of people do on Twitter. And for me,
Yep.
it's a waste of time. But I also, having participated in at least the two biggest ones in Lebanon, and knowing a lot of people from Syria and elsewhere who have participated in even bigger stuff and more difficult stuff, I don't quite know what to do with that question, if that makes sense. The question of like, how serious should this be, if that even makes sense. If the word serious is the correct term, because I'm not quite sure what it is.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's like, I mean, I think, this is like, so like a lot of what Occupy was like Vicky was one of the people who was like originally at it, and like it was like one of the things that I got like from her descriptions of it and from David Graeber, who's also one of the like the first people in New York, is that it's like they were kind of like importing stuff from different places. Like Vicky talks about like, oh hey, we can do the Spain like occupation of the squares here, and David Graeber is talking about like uh oh we can have an Argentina here, and it's like it's this attempt to, I think, like solve the problem of like what do you how do you actually change anything in a place where like the sort of like in a world in which the sort of collective identity that used to drive people to do things is just gone, and it's weird. It gets you to these political roadblocks. It gets you, yeah. I think to sort of aestheticization of politics that becomes like, it's kind of double-edged sword, because like on one hand like it lets it spread, but on the other hand it's like, so what actually is like like what you get this sort of like kind of incoherent, like this very incoherent populism, and I don't really know what the sort of answer to that is. Like I don't think like a return, because this is the thing in the 70s, right? It's like all these people who are like incredibly serious revolutionaries, and like all the incredibly serious revolutionaries like start doing armed struggle, and like and the product of all the incredibly serious revolutionaries doing armed struggle is like the what's it called, the United Red Army in Japan, just like murdering each other over like incredibly bizarre doctrinal squabbles, or like you have like uh the weird like urban guerrilla groups in like West Germany. It's like you get the United Red Army, and it's like it's like you get the Red Army faction in Germany, and like all these like weird kind of bombing things, like I don't know, and that stuff also just like didn't really go anywhere. So it's like I don't know, and I think this is, I just
Well,
this is the
one might argue, because I have thought about this specific aspect, because this is a very random factoid that most people don't know, but so it's the Japanese, so it's the JRA, the Arab JRA, some of them after the Lord Airport
yeah,
massacre.
right, yeah, this is yeah.
So, for those who don't, I mean, I'm not. It's not that important, but the point is that there is an aspect in which even that can become an aesthetic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
And the authoritarianism that ends up growing within such movements as that one is pretty, I think, notorious example of it. Um, I went, so I'll mention how I first discovered reading it. Discovered them is that I met one of them. I met one of
Oh,
one of the
cool.
members who's in,
That's wild.
because there are a few of them who are still in Beirut, and I spoke to that person. And to be honest, this might sound weird, but I wasn't particularly impressed. And
Yeah.
that's putting aside, I didn't know what they particularly did, so I don't know if they committed something bad,
Yeah.
because some of them
Yeah.
did commit pretty horrible stuff.
Yep.
Most didn't, but like some of them did, and so I didn't know if that he was one of those persons. But there was a sense that I felt, well, it's almost like I need to, I don't know, like I can't ever be in that group in that sense. Like there was an in group, they will know one another, or they at least know what, like they know of each other's reputations, and that become an aesthetic, and it become an aesthetic that is now past Like, this
Yeah.
is something that they did in the 70s and the 80s, essentially, and that sort of carries them on to the 90s and 2000s and
Mhm.
whatever. And so the reason why I'm not as harsh, maybe if that's the term, towards aspects of even the Lebanese protests, for example, that did feel at times like they were too aesthetics oriented, like as in there wasn't enough of concrete action or demands or what have you. Even saying that, I don't know what that would look like. I don't know what is enough, if that makes sense. But clearly there was some kind of lack. It felt obvious. But I'm not as harsh towards that because I also think that just a lot of people are just very disoriented.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
think it's kind of everywhere at this point, and
Yeah.
it has so many different roots, changes from context to context. I'm sure I'm not gonna have any kind of like, you know, too generalized statements here, but it's part of why I sort of, and this is me kind of taking a step back from even my previous self in some sense, where I was too judgmental about some of these things. And I don't like people shouldn't get me wrong. Like we should still be critical. We should critique. We should be like.
Mhm.
That's not what I mean by harsh in that sense. I just feel like we should also work just as much, just as hard, if not harder, to actually come up with alternatives that we complain
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
these people aren't doing, if that makes sense. Because I think a
Yeah.
lot of people are doing what they think is the best and what they think other people think is the best, like going to the squares, as I said, like this instinct of going to the squares. And most people do so because they feel like if they don't, then they're not actually doing anything.
Mhm.
And my take, in some sense, which is a relatively recent one, past couple of years, since the October Revolution in Lebanon, is that is, if that is a problem, then we should be working towards trying to find what the solutions to that problem
Yeah.
is, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Like figuring out how to do that is like that's just our job, I guess. Like we have to, I was reminded of this, probably my favorite Marx quote. It's from 18th Brumaire, and he's talking about how all of the sort of people in 18th Brumaire were trapped in this like all the people in the French Revolution 1848 were all trapped in sort of like the memory uh of the French Revolution, and how like there's an extent to which taking up the sort of mantle of previous revolutions is helpful, but it becomes this trap, and he has this line where he goes, the social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It can only begin with itself before it has stripped away all superstition about the past. The former revolutions require recollections of past world history in order to smother their own contents. The revolution of the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead in order to arrive at its own content. There, the phrase went beyond the content. Here, the content goes beyond the phrase. And I think it's like, I don't know. There's a lot of parts of it I
The
think
guy
really.
was a good writer. I think we can't deny
Yeah,
that.
yeah. When
He was a
when
really
when
good
he,
writer.
this is sort of an off-topic complaint, but like if you look at Capital, it's like when Marx is actually trying to write poetically and write clearly, he can do it. We know he can do it. Like we know he can say the things in Capital clearly because we have value, price, and profit. Like we know he can do it, and he just decides not to. It's just like it's just has decided that he's no. It is important that we do this in like the densest and most like incredibly esoteric German philosophical way possible. Yeah, but I think part of it is also, I mean, like I was thinking a lot about this when I was writing the piece, because I mean, there's this thing about like the revolution to the 19th century must let the dead bury their dead in order to arrive at its own content, and there's this like, and I think in some ways that becomes this sort of I don't know, like, there's this whole sort of aesthetic trap that, like, this is like what tankiism is. Like tankiism in a lot of ways is basically just an aesthetic, right? Like it's this sort of like kind of it's this kind of like nationalism. It's like part nationalism, part aesthetic around sort of like what the sort of 20th century revolutions are. And it's like at some point, like you have to let these people bury their dead, right? Like you have to let these revolutions die, because they're also gone, right? And you can't sort of move beyond it until you've like, you can't do anything new until you sort of like you've let that stuff die. And like that, and that's, I think part of, and like I think about this a lot with the sort of, with the way that like the sort of liberal and even like a liberal and conservative sort of like Chinese diaspora's politics has become just about like memory entirely, where they're all about memory, but they can't even remember it right, and they can't, it completely prevents them from ever doing anything, because they're stuck in this sort of like they're stuck in this like imagined moments of Tiananmen that they can't see properly, they can't sort of analyze properly, like they haven't, they're stuck in this version of the past that never existed. And I think that that's a problem for a lot of, I mean, for sort of everyone, right, where it's like we sort of lost our ability to like imagine a future. And so and partially communism always has sort of been about like a sort of a recollection of the past and recollection of things that used to exist, but like I don't know, we completely lost our ability to, like we lost our ability to imagine a future, and we lost our ability to sort of draw anything that could be different or new, even when, I mean, even when things that were like new happened, right? Like, like the US last summer, right? Like people burned down police stations, people like Donald Trump. I keep saying this over and over again on every podcast I'm on, but like Donald Trump was in a bunker and people were fighting the Secret Service hand to hand at the gates of the White House. Like, like stuff that like has like like just like has never happened in the history of the US happens, right? And we can't even process it because we're sort of lost in this this like haze of, this sort of like imagined past that we're all trying to get back to. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but
Well, I don't think there is one answer anyway. And
yeah,
the as it happens, like so last year after the explosion in the port of Beirut, I think like a few days after or something, I was on this other podcast, The Arts of Travel by Matt Der Margosian, who is a former guest as well. And he asked whether like the future looks a bit like Lebanon did back then.
Mhm.
And the thing is that on some level it does, on some level, or at least that it's a very concrete potential reality for parts of the world that haven't experienced that yet.
Yeah,
The other thing is, well, I mean, you're involved in that as well, like the It Could Happen Here stuff, the
yeah.
podcast. The whole crumble metaphor works quite well for that, because it wasn't a one day thing. I mean, the explosion definitely was. It was a few seconds thing, even. It was an extremely quick thing. But the aftermath of it is we're literally talking, and it's still happening. Like it's going to probably take quite a lot of time before one can say, well, this is done. Like this is, well, now it's something else or whatever. We're still very much in the aftermath of that. And for me, the difficulty is, I mean, it's on many levels other than emotional and personal and all of that. It's also like what can be done in a situation like this, because often what ends up happening is, I'll focus on the Lebanese example or the Lebanon example, is either you try and implement a solution that you think is going to work for everything and it doesn't.
Yeah.
And I'm saying you try and implement, you don't have the resources to implement it in the first place, but
Yep.
you try to, that the emphasis on that, or you give up, as many people have. And the thing that happens then, this is what interests me the most, and this is my own personal transformation in the past couple of years or so, and that's partly due to the PhD, because I study memory. The PhD is that I study memory in the past and how people remember and how people experience the past, how people experience time in general, and focusing on Lebanon, obviously. And what interests me is that whenever we think that we're giving up, or whenever we think that, and this is a super broad statement, whenever we think that like this is rock bottom, this is as bad as it gets, what it usually entails is that we then are too tired to do anything about it when we discover that it's not rock bottom. Like
Yeah.
we got to the point where like the helplessness in some sense is highly political.
Yep.
And my point, or what I'm trying to do, which is not easy, and for now it's basically through the podcast and just thinking about it out loud and maybe writing some stuff down, essentially, is what do we do with that helplessness? What do we do with that hopelessness, even if not helplessness? Maybe hopelessness is the best term. I'm not sure. And this is something that I remember a lot, or I still think about a lot, because it was the week that preceded the October Revolution in Lebanon, was the week of wildfires that was throughout the country and parts of Syria as well.
Yeah.
And it was horrific. Unfortunately, now it's even worse. And that I remember very well. It was like October 16th or something, like the day before. I was at a cafe with a friend, and we were talking about the then ongoing wildfires, and we were talking as if this is the worst that things can get. We were saying that this is
Yeah.
as bad as it gets, and there's no point anymore. Like, there was a kind of a depression essentially hitting us. And the next day was the revolution, and it's quite. I think even Vicky mentioned something like even Lenin was writing in the early something
Yeah. Yeah.
1917 saying nothing's gonna happen in my lifetime or whatever. And putting aside Lenin here, the point is that our expectations are always wrong.
Yeah.
And they're
I
always
remember
wrong
this.
because
Sorry.
they're always wrong because a huge part of it is probably due to that Marx code, that we are, at the end of the day, we're the results of our own experiences, and our own experiences aren't usually very well geared to the future. It's like we're actually trying to deal with the past all the time, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. I
Yeah, you were
remember like
saying, yeah.
there's like a very similar thing in the U.S. where like I remember like, you know, so right before the summer uprisings, like it's 3 months of COVID, and it was like the worst. Like, like it was a period where like it was COVID. It was it was the lockdown. It was also just this like the worst anti-Asian racism I've ever seen, just everywhere. Like, like people are getting stabbed in the streets, like people are getting acid. Like it was like, it was just like everyone was just like, it's also the sort of like Trump effect. Like everyone was sort of just like, well, we're screwed. Like, and then, you know, yeah, like just on a dime. So there's just like this 1 week where like like the police are fleeing a precinct, like in like where I'm in Chicago, like there's this like shopping district that's like, it's like the Miracle Mile, like this giant thing, like it's looted. Like the cops lose control of Chicago, and like and like I think in some ways like that was like, and then like after it sort of calms down, and after, like, especially after Kenosha, and after the shooting there, and after sort of, you have this sort of cycle around the election, that's like pacification cycle, and like the marshals start killing people, and and like suddenly we're back to like a very simple, not, I mean, I don't know if it's worse here than it was before in the same way that it is in Lebanon, but it's like I feel like there's this sort of like, I don't know, I mean, like we're about to have like several million people get evicted, like this yeah, like I think like that cycle is, it's happening sort
Yeah,
of
yeah. It's like,
over
I
and
mean,
over and over again, and
it's like there was a moment last year that it's like we spent a lot of energy on it or whatever,
yeah.
and now we're still recovering from that. And it is. I try as much as I can to. What happens in America is it's such a massive place, so
Yeah,
there's
it's
just
a disaster.
a lot of things happening all the time, and some good, a lot bad, etc. And one thing that I do find interesting is just that, again, is the whole that we are almost always wrong about when to anticipate
Yeah.
an event, and I'm putting event in quotation here. And we can be a bit better if we know like certain factors, like we know that things are bad in Lebanon, so whenever people ask me, do you think there will be an uprising, do you think there will be more protests, I tell them, yeah, probably, because it just makes sense.
Yep.
It's probably gonna happen. Now, for how long and how and in what, what form it takes, I don't know. I can make educated guesses, but that's as far as it will go. And one thing I did want to get your thoughts on, you did mention it a bit already, the whole phenomenon of online tankyism. Usually I've been trying as much as I can to basically ignore it on the internet. I
Yeah,
just don't reply
yeah,
and stuff like that. But talking about it can be more productive because I think it confuses a lot of people that aren't as well versed in their world,
yeah,
let's say.
yeah,
One thing that recently, a number of friends, all Palestinians as it happens, were very surprised that there were so many. I'm putting so many in quotations because in numbers they're not that many, but they're just super loud and active on the internet. Um, like Assadists and tankies and so on, they were just surprised that they would say something that for them they didn't expect that it would even have a backlash, like condemning the Assad regime,
hmm
and there would be a backlash. It surprises them and everything because they I will paraphrase one friend who I won't name her, of course, but she was very struck by how um almost coherent their worldviews are internally. Like they were speaking a certain language that they were all speaking. Basically, she went down a rabbit hole and started clicking a bunch of their links and stuff,
yeah, yeah,
and she was struck by how almost almost coherent. It's not always coherent, but almost coherent their world is when they're because they're mostly speaking to one another essentially, and everyone else is just black and white essentially. And so, with your own experience, like feel free to say as much as you want to say on this, and to kind of go back to the Tiananmen, so we kind of go back to the beginning in some sense and have a nice circle. How do you view the how is Tiananmen discussed in those circles, other than just denying everything, which is what they usually do? And what do you think? Like, just talk about it. Like, how do you
yeah,
understand it? And for those who don't know, try and explain it if that's okay.
yeah. The funny thing is, like, part of the reason I wrote this piece was because I was like sick of arguing with these people, and I was like, I'm specifically going to write a piece that's not for you. Like,
Exactly,
this
and I
is
think
like,
I think that's the best thing to do, to be honest. But yeah,
yeah, and like, and they still got really mad at it. But it's funny because it's like, they talk about how it's like it's almost consistent, but like it can't be fully coherent. And the reason it can't be fully coherent is because so like the realization I had about this a couple of days ago is that what tankyism is basically is that the rallying cry of 2011 revolutions is people want to follow the regime, right? And okay, so you have this, and then the regimes go, okay, how do we stabilize ourselves, right? And what tankyism is, right, and this is the same thing in some sense that like that what fascism is tankyism is a way to convince people that people actually want the regime, that like the regime is safe, the regime is sort of like the regime is the only thing like standing between you and the like Islamist barbarians. Like it's like this is sort of what it is, and it plays into this sort of like I mean, it plays into this sort of like this affective guilt thing, which is a big part of American politics, and I think a lot of this is to do with the fact that like nobody, the American left specifically, just has not ever processed the fact that like a huge majority of the people in it like used to be Christians, and then they never dealt with like this guilt crap that like comes out of sort of yeah of like especially just the like absolutely like specifically like the American Christianity in particular has this like this it's the like American Christianity, like this like these people, this is the slave religion, right? Like this is where like a lot of it is born from, and this stuff like and it's like they never, so they won't engage really ever with sort of like left-wing Christianity, and then simultaneously they won't engage with the fact with how much their views were being shaped by the fact that they never quite left this right-wing Christianity. And so you get this guilt stuff, and like this is and like a lot of it is sort of is white guilt. It's guilt also about sort of being Western, and they don't have a way to process this. So what they do is like they basically put on a mask. Like what Tinkism is, like it's a way to put on like a brown mask over sort of like one day I'm going to write a piece called white skin brown masks. That's about like these people just but like calling yourself a tanky is a way to sort of you can like invoke all of these like struggles by like people across the world who are like not white, and you can wear it, and you can be like, oh hey, like and the second part of it is it lets you, anyone who disagrees with you, you can go like, oh you're white. And it's like if they're even if they're not white, like it gives you the ability to like strip people of their sort of like non-whiteness and like project it lets like a white person project their whiteness onto someone else who disagrees with them.
Oh yeah,
And
I've been called like a white Orientalist
yeah,
by white
yeah,
Americans. Like
yep, I give it
and
too.
I
Like
and I
it's
and I don't know what to do in that situation. Like I don't know how to answer to that.
yeah, it's like well, yeah, and like this is the sort of yeah, it's like they're because it's like it's not really a politics in some ways. It's like it's an affect and it's an identity. And and Tiananmen's a good example though of as a politics is completely incoherent because okay, so there's like three versions of the sort of nihilism they do. One is that nothing, like it never happened, no one got killed. That one is kind of falling out of favor because you can't sustain it. Like it's like ridiculous. Like the CCP admits that things happen there. Like the second one is to say that nobody died in the square, and like okay, and this is where everything falls apart. And the third one, the second one is no one died in the square, and the third one is the whole thing was the Russian back color revolution, and so it was good to suppress it. And the latter two are point to the incoherence of this because, like, yes, it is true that most of the killing happens outside of the square, but that doesn't help you. Like if you're supposed to be a socialist, right? That doesn't help. Like the fact that the government did not kill the liberal pro-capitalist students, but instead killed the workers who were anti-capitalists. Like I mean, and this people talk about this, like the workers in the workers in the streets are quoting Marx, right? Like and those are the people who the CCP kills, right? Just murders them, and and so that part, like you start to see how this policy is actually incoherence. Like what is your actual justification for why they murder all these workers? And so they just stop talking, like they disengage. And the third thing is about, and this is the line that the sort of modern CCP is taking, is like, well, this was an early color revolution, and we defeated the color revolution, and because we defeated the color revolution, we didn't end up like Russia. And it's like, and the thing about that is, again, is this comes back to the thing where the student protesters got reincorporated into the party. And it's like, and then the students get reincorporated into the party, and then the CCP proceeds to carry out exactly the economic reforms that they wanted. So it's like, yeah, like the students won, right? Like they got what they wanted. They got to go be party bureaucrats, right? They got to go run the economy. They got to just like they literally they destroyed the entire class. Like they completely destroyed the Chinese urban working class. Like it just was completely annihilated as a class, as a political force. But then like, okay, but then and like that happens, right? But then like, if you're a tankie, you still have to say that this is socialism, and it's like it doesn't, everything just comes apart really quickly the moment you like pull on any threads. Like the other one, like like they have a lot of, like, the reason I talk about it also is like a form of nationalism, is that they spend all this time sort of like rewriting a coherent version of the past, but it's like it's not like, like these are people who claim that both China and Vietnam are socialist, and that China, and simultaneously that China's not imperialist. And it's like, well, they invaded Vietnam. Like what like they invade, like that's the most, like, other than invading Afghanistan, it's like the most imperialist thing you can possibly do. And so it all starts to fall apart. And like, I mean, there's another example of this where they're all pro Gaddafi, and it's like, and they're pro Gaddafi and they're pro Sankara at the same time. And like Gaddafi like helped overthrow Sankara and helped the U.S. invade Iraq. It's like, it's God, I'm just like getting annoyed. It's like it's almost consistent, but it can't be, because like, it's really just, it's really what it really is sort of, it's a naked defense of the regime. And the regime is not a coherent thing. Like these people, like they don't, like, the regime doesn't have like an anti-imperialist politics. It doesn't have like a coherent sort of like the only politics it has is being in charge. And like the regime, quote unquote, will like, they'll overthrow other people who are like also the regime. Like like Gaddafi will do his heel turn and like ally with the U.S. for 30 years, right? Like he'll be taking pictures with Tony Blair, but they can't deal with this. And like they refuse to accept that any of it's happening. And so and the other part of it, I think, is that like it's kind of a grift, and it's a grift by like a few different groups of people. Like you have people who run the PSL, and they're doing this because basically to like fund their sort of vanity presidential runs, and just like really horrifying abuse. And then there's like the gray zone people, and you can want, like, the gray zone people right now are like fully doing anti-vax. Like Max Blumenthal is like Max Blumenthal has turned into one of those guys who, like, He's complaining that YouTube won't let him do a live stream where he yells at his coworkers for not being anti-vax enough. Like, and part of it also is like, it's this thing where people sort of saw where the winds were blowing politically. Like they saw, in 2014, 2015, when the revolutions are dying, right? They saw that the world was sort of drifting into more authoritarianism. It was drifting right. It was drifting into sort of this like the sort of morass of like just the right-wing authoritarian like patriarchal politics away from the sort of revolutionary like liberatory stuff. And they were like, oh well, we could sell this on the left too. And so they did. And and the consequence of this is you have a bunch of these people who are extremely well funded, and then also they're extremely well funded, they're well coordinated online, and they just like literally all they do. And the other thing I think like is it's like it's a way to pacify people, because like if you believe that like China is socialism, right, you don't have to do anything. You can just sit there, right? You can sit there and do nothing, and eventually China will sort of liberate you, right? If you believe like that, like all you have to do, if you believe that like I don't know, like that like Vietnam is socialist, is that like all you have to do is sit there online and yell at everyone who says it is not, because that'll stop the CIA from overthrowing them somehow. I don't know, and it's frustrating, and I think just like I don't, but I think that's also why they're so focused on Tiananmen, is that like you know like they're kind of they're these people, like they're the mirror image of sort of the liberal press, right? Like they care about the same things the liberal press does, but they have the science reversed. But it's also important for them that nobody reads Tiananmen in the context of of the sort of 20th century workers movement, because because if you read it from the context of 20th century workers movement, like the CCP is on the wrong side. And it's extremely ideologically and sort of like personally important to them, and it is important to their ability to sort of like make themselves less white and less Western, that nobody understands what actually happened there, and nobody understands what the potential of it is and what the sort of horror of it was.
Yeah, and quickly on that, so we don't spend too much time on it.
Yeah, sorry.
No. It's I mean, I meant it for me. Like one thing I think is also very clear, that they are a war or whatever. I've blocked most of them, but like emotionally invested in delinking Syria and or Libya from the rest of the Arab Spring, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And not that they spend too much time on the rest of the Arab Spring anyway, but in the sense that there is something very unsettling for them. The fact that, especially in 2011, Syrians and Bahrainis and Libyans and Tunisians and whatever were sort of doing the same thing. Were sort of asking for more or less the same thing. In Bahrain, it was more reform oriented than revolution oriented, but whatever, which would already have been a big deal in Bahrain. And for me, the more interesting, I mean, it is interesting on some level to understand why these phenomena happen and how someone can be so ideologically extreme, regardless of reality, essentially. And that's regardless of whether they call themselves left wing or right wing. Like at that point, it's almost like they kind of echo one another. But for me, what's more interesting also, like these past couple of years, is stuff that I've been trying to do more frequently, is see how this affects the people that are technically being talked about. And the most obvious example that I can give is like me interviewing when I was still working on Global Voices a few years ago, like members of the White Helmets in Syria. And a number of them had no idea that there was this online insanity going on while they were just helping people on the ground and saving people from under the rubbles and whatever, because they didn't have time to look for that shit. And a lot of them were like actually puzzled, and when I told them like a lot of it is Russian government disinformation and that sort of thing, it kind of clicked, and I said, oh well, okay, well then it fit into a story in that sense, like well, they're bombing us, so obviously they're going to spend a lot of online resources doing propaganda. That's what governments do when they invade places. And so for them, that made complete sense, because there's this imperialist thing, and we are the victims of imperialism, and there's the online dimension to it. And at the same time, a lot of the people that were joining this online imperialist campaign, or the online dimension of it, let's say, were people on the left and people on the far right at the same time. And
Yep.
right now, what we have is, for the most part, the left-wing politicians I'm talking about Europe, for the most part, don't do much Assadism anymore. They kind of don't think about it anymore. But it's the far right that has continued. So it's the Front
Yeah.
National that's in Damascus. It's
Yep. Yep.
that sort of thing. So I will try whenever I find the energy to do an episode that is entirely on this.
Yeah.
But for now, we'll say goodbye to the tankies.
Yeah. Well, can I say one more thing about that though?
Sure,
Just
sure,
a
yeah,
hopeful,
yeah, yeah.
like, okay, like I think their whole political project is a product of sort of the collapse of the last revolutionary cycle, right? And part of also what they're doing is getting people to ignore the fact that like we're in another one, right? But like and I think it's the sort of the sort of kind of rightish social democratic politics that emerges in the U.S. I think that's all fading. And I think you can see this because in the sort of gray zone pivot to anti-vax, right? Like they're all of the sort of American left, like all of their podcasts, all of their sort of media stuff, like it's all going under. Like there's been this, like when the sort of Bernie campaign failed, and when like when summer uprising happens, like they didn't know what to do with it, and they like the PSL like actively was like fucking over people in sorry, am I allowed to swear in this? I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
like,
you're.
okay, they're just like actively were like working to fuck over the protest in like Philly, right? And like it got to the point where like just random people and like random protesters in Philly were like they would see PSL signs and they would like attack them in the street because the PSL had like led them into police traps and they were like co-opting stuff. And like I think they're on the way out. Like their politics is declining. Like they can't maintain like this it's too incoherent. Like they can't maintain their sort of media engines in the way that they had before. And and it's not it doesn't necessarily mean that people who replace them are going to be better, right? Like there's the U.S. has produced like even like stunningly even more vaguely left wing grifters are like moving into, but like I don't think like these people aren't going to be around forever, and they're not going to be in control of the left, and they're not going to be the people who actually like in the next like 5 years, right? Like they're not going to be the people who are driving anything that happens. And I think that yeah, like if
Again,
like if
that's
we can
a it's
bury
a
these politics.
yeah, like, and I think that's something that's important to remember for a lot of the people who spend too much time, trying to dunk on them or whatever. I'm not gonna, it's none of my business. Whatever you do with people, whatever people do with their own time,
Just too
the
much.
whatever. Like, but I do think like your article, for example, for Lausanne, sort of, I don't know, analyzing thing in a more slowed down analysis in some sense is as important, if not more important. And I'm not pointing any fingers. I've done it a bunch of times, and it's just, for me, something that I've tried to reduce in the past, again, year, couple of years,
Me too.
essentially. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it is important. I do think like doing that is what then would allow a piece like Lausanne, like the one that you wrote for Lausanne. Okay, well, on that note of hopeful note that of Tanky is fading away. What are 3 books that you would recommend for our listeners, and why? Pitch the books.
Okay. I think that the first one I'm going to talk about is called Rhythms of the Pachacootie, and it's I just realized I forgot to send you the link with the books. I will do this after. Yeah. But yeah, it's called Rhythms of the Pachacootie, and it's about it's by someone who was in. So basically, she was in a Marxist group like with the current like Bolivian vice president. Or like, actually, he's not. I guess he's no. He's actually out. But yeah, he was Evo Morales' vice president. And like and they broke in 2 different directions, right? The wing that takes the wing of this that's sort of like kind of Marxist group who allies themselves with Evo, like that takes power, sort of breaks towards developmentalism, and then there's another wing that breaks towards sort of I guess you could like the potential of a sort of like indigenous ecological politics. This is a vast simplification of what's going on here. There's yeah, and a lot of this is about sort of the conflict between different sort of visions of what indigenous liberation is. Yeah, but it's basically it's Origins of the Pachacuti is an account of roughly from 2001 to 2005 this enormous series of social conflicts and what are genuinely revolutions that break out in Bolivia, where people like they block every road, like in a bunch of indigenous uprisings happen. They block every road in the country. They starve out the capital. They bring down multiple governments. There's all these intense battles over sort of over water, over natural gas, over control of these resources, over whether it should be community controlled or sort of corporate controlled against privatization, neoliberalism. It's really this it's just absolutely this incredible account of the potential of that moment, of what people were doing in that moment, of this sort of now kind of forgotten struggle that was like really one of the key things that was happening in the early 2000s. Yeah, so definitely that one is great. It's kind of academic-y, but it's worth getting through it because the analysis is incredible, and just the history of that moment is something that's just been sort of lost. And it'll also help you understand like modern sort of Bolivian politics a lot, because you'll understand like where these people came from, like what they were actually there to do. Yeah, and so the second book I'm going to recommend, because I sort of always recommend it, is David Graeber's Utopia of Rules, which is one of my favorite books. It's basically it's a collection of essays that are in different ways looking at the problem of bureaucracy and looking at how bureaucracies work, how specifically how sort of violence and the way that bureaucracy sort of simplify information are connected in very interesting ways in the way that connects to governance. There's a very interesting argument about sort of how like what we think of as democracy, like electoral representative democracy, is actually an aristocratic thing. And it's also it's David Graeber, right? So this is the book of essays that he got published. That was like his like, I have a career now, I can just publish things. So he published this. And, it's like he has this like his analysis of the state, right? It's like this is like his full presentation, the analysis of the state, and it's the whole thing is an extended digression, like from him making an argument about Dungeons and Dragons, and then like he has this analysis of fascism. The analysis of fascism is like this. It's basically in the middle of him trying to explain the politics of superhero movies. It's like it's great. He's going all over the place. It's really fun. And I think so. The last book. This was the one I had problems. I'm choosing number 3 because there's so many. But
one thing that you should know is that almost everyone always cheats and always recommends a 4th, so it doesn't matter. I have no rules on this podcast.
Okay, so the third one is this book called Carbon Democracy by Timothy Mitchell, and it's okay. So I want to say right off the bat, the very opening part of his analysis is kind of a mess, because he doesn't understand the difference between, I say this admittedly as someone who is extremely guilty of lumping together a bunch of different left-wing movements, but he doesn't quite understand exactly the difference between a bunch of people who want to nationalize something and a bunch of people who want to run something democratically by like unions or by councils or whatever. But with that caveat out of the way, it's a really, really interesting account of the role of, I guess the academic term would be the specific materiality of different kinds of fossil fuels. But like the physical characteristics of coal, and how you get it out of the ground, and how you ship it, and how it moves across logistics lines, and how what kind of consciousness that mining coal forms, versus how oil is sort of how that's different with oil, and how that like shapes the sort of course of history. And there's a whole bunch of stuff about how it's sort of broad argument. Also, there's a lot about how coal mining specifically is one of the things that generates the sort of the very militant 20th century workers movement, because coal miners are extremely militant, and then they have the potential to like a coal mining strike can actually just sort of like just bring a country to its knees, because the way the sort of grids work and the way the sort of transportation works means that you could block one part of it, the whole thing goes under. Whereas oil isn't like that, and in fact, like strikes by oil workers actually make it because the problem with oil is that there's too much of it, and so you in order to make money off of oil, you have to make sure you have to keep other people from drilling oil, because if everyone just drilled oil, it would cost like basically nothing. And so, in that context, strikes are ineffective because, if you cut off oil production, you're just making oil more expensive, and that's good for the company. And so, and it's this whole thing about how that's the way that these fossil fuels like shape the 20th and 21st centuries. It's very, very interesting and very cool. And then okay, short plug.
Well, if you want to go for a fourth one, go for it.
Yeah, all right. Short plug book 4. So the book that made me an anarchist is called Hara Shuzo and Pure Anarchism in Interwar Japan, which is about this. It's a really obscure struggle now, but Japan had this incredibly powerful anarchist movement from starts in the sort of early 1900s and ends basically in they all get killed over the course of sort of the 1900s to the 20s. But it's this really interesting account of this battle that plays out where Hara Shuzo is one of the major theorists of it, between anarcho-communism and syndicalism, which isn't like, we don't really have that in the West. Like that wasn't really that much of a fight. Like in like Spain, for example, famously, like, the CNT, everyone, the Revolutionary Anarchist Organization is the CNT FAI, right? The CNT is a syndicalist wing, but the reason the thing functions is that the CNT basically gets hijacked by the anarcho-communist group, the FAI, right? But in what's it called? In Japan, they fight it out. And like there's this great thing of like all the anarcho-communists are like calling the syndicalists Bolsheviks, and like it's this whole, but there's a bunch of really interesting, they have a bunch of incredibly interesting theoretical battles about like, and actually this is part of, because the anarcho-communists have this critique of syndicalism, of democracy in the factory, which is about like, well, okay, but like you're still preserving the factory system, you're still preserving the system where every day you wake up, you go to a job and you do the job and you go home, right? Like you're still preserving this divide. You're still preserving divides between the city and the country. You're preserving all of these sort of aspects of capitalism. And, and it also gets into the sort of like Shuzo's an abuser. Like he's like sucks. And like in a lot of ways. And, and you have this sort of the sort of like the contradiction of anarchism, which is that you have a lot of people who are doing a lot of things that are good. And then also, they do a lot of stuff that's like really fucked up, and at the same time, like in Japan, like all these people get murdered. Like Shuzo's like the exception because he like kills himself, but like everyone, like every other major anarchist theorist, like is murdered either by the state or by fascist paramilitaries. And so it's this sort of, I don't know, it's a very interesting, kind of bleak-ish, but look at this sort of this struggle that most people have just forgotten. A
couple of things. While you were talking, I thought of this book. I tried to have him on, but he doesn't do audio interviews, so I'm gonna maybe interview him by print. His name is Shoko Nishi. He has a book called Anarchist Modernity. The subtitle is Corporatism and Japanese-Russian Intellectual Relations in Modern Japan. And it's just one of the most random stories, random from my vantage, that one can read, and I highly recommend it as well. Listeners, you don't have to be an anarchist to enjoy that book. The other thing is, I knew David like Graeber from SOAS days when I did my master's there, and it's one of my main regrets now not having him on, because we had actually talked about it, and he had actually like said sure, but we just never did it, and unfortunately he passed away. But Christopher, this has been long but super productive, and it's fine. This happens all the time. This happens all the time. As I said, there are no rules on this podcast. Thanks a lot for your time. Keep up the good work, and I'm sure we'll be chatting again soonish anyway.
Thank you for having me on.
The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.